The CDC's National Center for Injury Prevention and Control estimates 5.3 million Americans, or 2% of the population, is living with a disability as a result of a traumatic brain injury. Dr. Jennifer Blanchette is a psychologist and brain health consultant who specializes in psychotherapy after a brain injury, incorporating cognitive rehabilitation, trauma therapies, mindfulness, and she's also the host of the Tbi Therapist Podcast, which explores the intersection of mental health, trauma, and brain injury. She's a brain health consultant for professionals, athletes, and leaders. She joined me this week to have a conversation about psychotherapy following a brain injury, recovering your cognitive abilities, and so much more. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. I began my conversation with Blanchette by her providing a professional snapshot of her work, the impact it's making, and the overall difference that she hopes to impart on the field.
Yeah. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Maine, and I specialize working with people who've had a concussion, traumatic brain injury, or other acquired brain injury like a stroke. So I really honed in on that part of my practice and felt that I really feel called and love working with folks who are struggling with that specific disability. Although I work with folks with other disabilities or neurodevelopmental disorders or conditions. Sometimes we call that more neurodiverse now, which I kind of like that. Instead of having a disorder, just we have a different brain. So I certainly work with folks who kind of have a little bit of a different brain, who may kind of be, have some attention stuff, be more ADHD, quote unquote. And I find that getting that specific help has been really so helpful for most of the people that I work with, that it's really not something that is treated often by mental health professionals. So yeah, I don't know if you have any questions based on any of that.
Yeah, so let's dive a little bit deeper into that because, Jennifer, I was born with cerebral palsy. So I was curious to ask you about sort of the psychosocial development sort of correlation and whether it has sort of a correlation for anyone that has cerebral palsy specifically.
Yeah, I'm not well versed on cerebral palsy, so I haven't seen too many folks with that. So I can talk certainly about psychosocial things, definitely. And I think there's great overlap, I think, with a lot of different conditions or disabilities, certainly. I think psychosocial development for my people, a lot of them did not have what we call a congenital condition, or they didn't grow up with that condition. So they have an acquired brain injury. It happened later. So I find a lot of my folks maybe had a life was a certain way, and they made friends a certain way. They interacted with people in a certain way, like at work or whatever. And then they had this great shift in their life where everything changed. Now, I will add the caveat that I have worked with people who've had a concussion or a traumatic brain injury, these tended to be more severe, or folks that maybe were born with, half a brain or something like that. And they more grew up with that condition. So they grew up having a different brain. And I think then faced challenges in school, in interpersonal relationships, in eventually going to work, because then they might have needed accommodations, or just having people that understand that, hey, we just need to go about things differently, and they are a great asset to the workforce. But I think sometimes people don't see that, or they don't take the time to see what an asset someone can be that might just show up a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you also host a podcast called the TBI Therapy Podcast, which explores the intersections of mental health, trauma, and brain injury. So I'm wondering if you can tell me about it.
Yeah, so I developed this podcast, the TBI Therapist Podcast, and I interview people who've had a brain injury, a concussion, or a stroke, or other types of injury. I've had people who've had a brain tumor, so different acquired conditions that have happened to their brain over the course of their life. And my idea for the podcast was really to provide hope and inspiration and resources, because a lot of times when I first see a client in my clinical practice, especially related to the mental health side of things, it's been overlooked or downplayed. And really for some folks, they've been told, it's just anxiety. It's not part of your brain injury anymore, or we've done all we can do with your brain injury. You need to go see the psychologist now. And that is hard for me to see when their mental health has been either neglected or it's at the end of the road and we're just like, okay, we've done all we can do for you, and now you need to get mental health treatment. And I think there's a lot of shame around that too, where people feel like somehow they didn't do things right, or they have failed in some way in their recovery. And I really see it as more of the problem with our medical system of not attending to the needs, especially the mental health concerns related to brain injury, concussion, and other ABIs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious to dive just a little bit deeper into your last answer and how we really create more resources that make a difference when it comes to mental health concerns and treating people with mental health sort of issues. How do you think we curb that difficulty that we're experiencing?
Yeah, again, multiple systems are involved here. So I also listen to a lot of therapy podcasts, and so I kind of have my pulse on what's happening in mental health as well. So even if we start with the therapists, so there's not enough therapists for clients, period. So I think we need more funding, certainly, to get therapists in these programs, to encourage the profession, because I think if we want to have more therapists that are highly trained, then we need to start in the schooling to recruit more therapists who might be appropriate. So that's one thing. Certainly we need more therapists. I found as a psychologist that I mainly focus on therapy in my practice right now. That it's really hard to navigate all of the hoops that you need to jump through to see the client, to bill the insurance, to get paid, to do all the things. So just making it easier on the provider end to deliver that service in a way that we are compensated for our expertise, which is a significant amount of schooling for a majority of us. And we're able to deliver that in a way that also doesn't burn us out, because it's intense work. So I would say that's on the therapist side of things. Creating more awareness and support for the therapists. On the other side, the client side, I think access to care is certainly a concern. So is there a therapist they can get in touch with? Does their insurance take, again, that goes back to like the government wanting to subsidize or, encourage people coming into the therapy profession. But a lot of people are struggling with access to care. So they want to see a therapist, but either there are no therapists available or they can't afford it. So I think making therapy affordable and also just reaching out when they need it. So even if you can't find a therapist, there's so many other resources available. So there's certainly hotlines. There's also community supports, I think, that people don't tap into, certainly that can be a support. And then just awareness in the family. So having discussions within your own family about mental health and about emotions and about the importance of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jennifer, tell me, how do you think we can make this profession more attractive in order to attract more therapists, in your opinion?
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I haven't really thought of. So I think certainly like the cost of the education is part of it, especially in the US. Other countries might do this better. I don't know, but in the US, certainly making it easier to access education and the licensure process it took me, let's see, I have 4 degrees in psychology. I didn't need to get all of those. But by the time to become a psychologist, it was 4 years of schooling plus an extra year, an internship year, then another year on top of that for licensure. So for a psychologist, it's 6 years, licensure exams, all of that jazz. So, and it's really hard to navigate for some people, that licensure process. So again, making it a little more easy for therapists to navigate that, I think, could be part of it. But to attract them, I think that would certainly be the national organizations, like for social work and for psychology, to, have people understand what the profession is about and how they can make a living and support other people in their community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to also dive deeper into the fact that I know that you help leaders and change makers heal from trauma and bring back the power of sort of their nervous system by hacking it. So tell me about that process and how it works.
Yeah, so I love working with leaders, athletes, professionals, people who are change makers in this world, but they're struggling. They might have a unique brain or a different brain, and they need more support. So they might identify as someone who's more scattered or kind of struggles with their productivity, or they've had something happen that they have a block and they can't get past that block. So I really think about brain health first. Before we do any productivity hacks or doing any other things, we have to think about, how healthy is my brain right now? And I think there are 4 things that I always talk about with people, and I see it as building our house for brain health. So the first part, or the first corner of the house, would be movement or exercise. I don't like the word exercise, so I use movement because people like to move in different ways. So the CDC has recommended that we get 150 minutes of exercise or movement per week. A lot of us are not getting that. So as also a fitness instructor, I teach fitness classes as well. I'm a yoga teacher, but I mostly teach fitness, honestly, because I love music and movement. And so I think really seeing that person, how they like to move. For some people, it might be walking. For some people, it might be the yoga. Other people, they're a weightlifter. And I don't want to change what they do, but I want to encourage them to see that as something they need for their brain and total health. So that's the one component. The other components would be, so movement, nutrition is key. So our cells need energy. So it's important to think about what we're putting in our bodies and how that fuels our cognitive functioning. So your brain can't function without glucose. And we need that food and fuel to be able to sustain our functioning. So I think about talking with people about, what does their diet look like and how can they improve it? How can they add nutrition if they're not getting appropriate nutrition? Another component we don't think about for our brain health is social interconnectedness and belonging. So there's been some really great research on mortality and social connectedness. And the more connected we are, the longer we live. And this is actually more robust than exercise, than obesity, than smoking like a pack of cigarettes. Social interconnectedness would probably be one of the top things. We always hear about the exercise, the diet, whatever. We don't really talk too much about, okay, do you have a best friend, or do you have someone that you talk to every day? That is really important, especially if we're talking about people who might struggle with a unique brain or have a disability or have something that might be a barrier to social interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Jennifer, one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast was, having cerebral palsy myself. Sometimes I deal with social isolation, so I use this podcast as sort of a way to connect with people. I'm curious to ask you, since you brought up social connectiveness. Yesterday I went to the Lions home opener with a group of people that I've interviewed through this podcast. So I'm curious to ask you about social connectiveness and getting back to that sort of post-COVID.
Yeah, I just find that where a lot of people are really hungry for that. They're really looking for it. But I think our patterns in COVID of isolation doubled down on a pattern of isolation that we were already falling into in modern life with, everybody more online. That was already happening pre-COVID. And I think COVID just kind of like sparked that fire. Great things came out of COVID with regard to like technology and things like that. However, we became way more isolated as a society. And so our normal rhythms of life really changed. And I don't think they've returned to normal rhythms of life. And so it's going to take work for some folks, for a lot of folks, to think and be creative about how can I try to meet new people. I really commend you for starting this podcast to say, this is how I'm going to connect with people and really like build relationships that I have more throughout my life. So I think that's awesome. And that's really modeling for other people that you can think outside the box.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you describe yourself as curious, thoughtful, and sort of goal-oriented. So tell me about your passion for working for people and what fascinates you the most about working with people and sort of understanding what makes them tick as individuals.
Yeah. So can I finish just the four things? One last thing I didn't get to, and then I'll get to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just holding that one little. So our last prong would be sleep. So always thinking about our rests and our sleep is really important. So we can leave that over there. That's the last one. So how I become curious about people. I think that started. It just was innate in me, right? I was very curious about the experience of other people, and I think was kind of born into kind of that helper role. Like I always saw myself as someone who likes to help out, that likes to, talk with people. And I think we often are quick to judgment, but not leaning into curiosity about someone's experience. And I think if we stay more curious, we can learn so much more about the person. So I think curiosity has almost become, for me, this kind of life goal that I want to stay curious. I want to stay in a place where I don't know things, and that's okay, because there's always more to learn, especially about other people or the brain or whatever it is. And I approach that from each person that I see, and especially with brain injury, because you can have, and you can speak to this maybe about cerebral palsy, but everyone that I've seen who even has a similar concussion or brain injury, all that shows up differently in their lives, and their resources they need is just very different for each person. So I think if we just kind of think about that when we meet with people, it's really, really helpful.
Absolutely. And Jennifer, I'm fascinated to ask you about, throughout your personal experience, what's the greatest professional lesson that you've learned that really has had sort of a profound impact on your personal life as well?
Yeah. I would say professionally would be learning more about mind body integration. So when I was training, a lot of my training was about the brain, about thinking, cognition, the science of the mind is psychology. And it really keeps you in your head. We forget that this head is connected to our body. We have a nervous system that goes from our brain all the way down our spine throughout our body. And I think understanding more about the interconnectedness of our mind and body has really had a profound impact on me, my family. Actually, I have my son was out back swinging, and there's this big swing that we have. It's like a big rope swing, and he had a new neighbor friend over, and she was scared. She didn't want to get on it, and my son said, "It's okay, listen to your body." And I was like, yes. It's now impacting my children, and they're understanding that it's okay to listen to when your body is giving you information. It's really important. Like, I'm noticing my heart rate is up. Like, what's happening? Can I just kind of drop into my body and notice what's happening right now? And I think professionally, that specifically the EMDR training that I did which is a trauma therapy, really helped me consider that mind body integration. And I also think of it as a fitness instructor too, because I'm also often teaching people about how to move.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Jennifer, when you look at today's society in general, you don't have to turn on the news for 5 minutes to see that there is sort of this cultural division within the world today. So I'm curious from your perspective as a psychologist, how do you look at the world in general and the way that we're sort of talking to each other to solve problems and come up with solutions? And how do you think the way that we're being perceived sort of in the media and in the public eye today affects the way that we think as people?
Yeah. So are you talking more about like kind of post-COVID, or just in general, like what you're seeing with people being a little more angry or frustrated, it seems, or our world is more divisive? Certainly, I could speak to that.
Yeah, we'll take it from both angles because I think there are distinct angles to both angles of that question. So we'll go both ways for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think about divisiveness, what I can just talk about my personal struggles a little bit. So, certainly through COVID, there was all these different societal things happening. There was the political stuff happening in the US. There was the racial reckoning that started with George Floyd, and certainly, other individuals were part of that I don't, want to neglect there. But how it showed up for me is that I started hearing more things from my clients, and some of them were kind of pro for, supporting maybe Black Lives Matter, or pro, whatever cause it was. Or maybe they were pro Trump and they're the other side of things. And for me, I had this moment where I was like, I can't hear people saying racist things to me in therapy. And I had to kind of come to a sense of, how do I deal with that? In the therapy room, how do I work through these issues? And I think I tried as much as possible to be curious with the experience of others, even when they were spewing hate, even when I was having reactions in my body about, how could you think this way? This is a tragic event that people are dying, and, I still tried to stay curious about these experiences of people who, to me, were spewing hate. And I think I didn't get political in the therapy room, so I'm grateful for that. That's really not my role. It's not my role there. But I think I listened to my body when my body had reactions about sitting through things like that. And maybe I knew like I can't work with that person long term because my body won't let me do it. My body won't allow me to be present for them and be the therapist that can like be non-judgmental with them. So it was more about maybe they need to be referred out or gone to work with another person. But I think staying kind and being there for that person while I was with them was important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone that may be watching this, I'm curious to get your opinion on how, if someone, I guess, couldn't afford working with a trained therapist or psychologist like yourself, how do you think people can really find their inner center and really find out who they are as people if they can't afford working with a trained professional?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's multiple ways. There's certainly like free resources like podcasts and books. So many people that I've worked with have said they've learned so many things through podcasting, through listening to great podcasts. There's a number of those that are mental health focused that are specific to certain disabilities, my podcast but there's many like from the Psychological Association. So if you can't afford it, I think arm yourself with information. Like what can I learn about something I'm struggling with that I can use? There, you can certainly use hotlines and resources like the National Suicide Hotline. Certainly always think that resource is there for you. There is also free counseling that is sometimes offered like in institutions who have a counseling center. So for example, where I trained, we had a counseling center that provided low cost therapy and students provided that therapy. So I was one of those students who provided therapy to clients, and it was a very low cost. What you could pay, $25 was the highest it was, or they would do basically whatever you could pay. The interesting thing about therapists who are trainees is that the therapy is shown to be just as effective than someone who's a seasoned therapist, which I have all kinds of thoughts about that, but that it's still great therapy. So even if you're seeing an intern or someone who is still in their training, I think the asset of that, having someone who's in training, is that they're very curious and they're going to really be super dialed in and want to give like their very best. Not that a seasoned therapist wouldn't, but I think they are just so fresh and ready and wanting to support you. So if there is an intern or a school center that's offering free counseling, take it up on, look in your areas. Is there a school that has a psychological services center? Some of them will have community spots. So that's one way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jennifer, I'm curious to ask you, based on your personal and professional experience, how do you view the word inclusion and diversity as it relates to equitable treatment for all people?
Yeah, inclusion and diversity. So certainly I think that all humans should be included in quality care for mental health, and that we should, aim to see the diversity in each one of us, whether that be cultural, racial, whatever is under the sun, that when we have diversity in society, we're best. I truly believe that a great society is a diverse society, and we celebrate diversity. We celebrate our uniqueness, and we don't look down on that uniqueness, that we celebrate it. And I think try to reach out to those who have, whether it be systemic racism or disenfranchisement, that have not had access. So as someone who can speak, who's had privilege, I think it's important for me to use my privilege to advocate for those who maybe haven't had privilege. So that certainly is one way to continue to reach out. But I think inclusion is trying to seek ways, and I think trying to connect with your profession about how can we be more inclusive and work to experience more diversity in our companies, in our roles throughout what we offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jennifer, I'm curious to ask you about if someone was to ask you to sort of encapsulate your uh, professional impact in one sentence, how would you want this sentence uh, describing your career to read to this point?
Wow. I'm going to have to take a minute and think about one sentence to encapsulate my career. Yeah, I think that I have been someone who has provided hope, who has provided journeying with another person and their deepest struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And my final question for you today has to do with your own professional and personal legacy and how you want that to be defined, and whether or not that you believe that it's important to have a life motto to sort of model your life by.
Hmm. Yeah, so you're asking what have I maybe modeled my life off of, or
Your legacy and how you want it to be
oh,
defined.
my legacy. Yeah. So I would say certainly I would love that my legacy would be that I've expanded knowledge about the brain and had more access to the information that people need, certainly about the brain, to get the services they need, to also just have the life that they want and a life that they want to live, would be a tremendous legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, tell me, if people want to get connected with the work that you do, what's the best way they can do that?
Yeah, so my website is tbitherapist.com. Also on Instagram, you can reach me at TBI Therapist.
Fantastic. Well, I really want to thank you for your work in the space of personal and professional development there, and really trying to bridge the gaps of unity and bringing us closer together. Your work in the space and time on my behalf is most appreciated, and I want to thank you for being here today. It's most appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.